Hi there, Victor Pross speaking to you, anarchist artist. Before I begin my podcast on the history of violence, my evil father, and my path to anarchism, a little bit of housekeeping would include bringing to your attention that I will be speaking at next Saturday with Walter Block and Tim Moen at the Libertarian Talks, and I will put the information into the body of this email with a link to the Facebook invite page. So if you happen to be in the Vancouver area, click on the link to get the full information, click going, and it will be a pleasure to meet you. And you would also have the pleasure of listening to Walter Block and Tim Moen and meeting them as well as kicking back, having a few drinks and good food, good company, and 3 presentations dealing with culture, art, liberty, politics, philosophy, all that fun stuff. And when I've just to let you in on a little story, beginning in the thrust of my podcast here is that I was planning on talking about culture, talking about art, anarchism, of course, in my talk, and I was also going to bring up my father, to not so much as to cover my history of my biographical information, but more or less to illustrate a point. And I was going to, use a history of my father in the service of illustrating a broader point, and dealing with anarchism and philosophy. But also, giving a little personal history, a little bit intimate story that tells you more about myself and my background and whatnot, entertaining as it can be. So that was what I was planning on doing. And lo and behold, call this serendipitous or an omen, who knows what it is. But today, wandering around the city, I ducked into a bookstore, as I am wont to do, used in the new ones. And I love reading, I'm always looking at going through the books and wandering into these stores, philosophy and biographies. It helps generate ideas for paintings. And I'm just a very curious, intellectually inclined person. But anyway, I digress. So I go into this bookstore and I see a book that grabs the title of the book grabs my attention, and I'm drawn over towards it. Like I say, being a very curious, intellectually, artistically inclined person, and liking things about art and culture and whatnot, I come across Vancouver After Dark: The Wild History of a City's Nightlife. Right, so I figured that would be like the music scene, the art scene, what was going on in the 1960s. And so I'm breezing through the book, and I thought, oh my God, what do I come across? Just leafing through the book, I come across an entire section or a chapter dealing with my father. There he is. There's my father. Very slick guy, suit and tie, on the phone, has a similar haircut to me. And next is a club. He was the founder of the club called the Bunkhouse. And there we can see a topless waitress. Her tits are sticking out, and she's got one of those drink holder things. And there's a musician in the background. And my father was the founder and operator of a popular little club in Vancouver City, 1960s, the Bunkhouse, right? So it's not every day that you wander into a bookstore and one of the first books that you happen to pluck off the shelf because it's standing prominently there as a newly released book, just came out this year, this book, and at a popular bookstore here in Vancouver City. And it's not every day that you pluck a book off a book shelf in a bookstore and find a chapter on your father, right? So that's very interesting. Now, really got me thinking about, like, my God, I've got to include the fact of this book, in my talk now, at the Libertarian talks, which I had already planned to do, to talk about my father. But now I got this book. It's just like so many things gelled. And the story in itself is interesting, let alone letting the story serve as the points of a broader base, like anarchism and whatnot. But let me tell you about my father. Let me read you some snippets from this book, and I'll give you some philosophical conclusions at the end of that. But the sheer story itself is pretty interesting. So listen to that. Let me wet my whistle here. The first sentence grabs you right off the bat. One of the most colorful figures in the history of Vancouver entertainment has to be Les Stork. That's my father, Les Stork. The background to that is that I was raised by my grandparents, and my grandmother married again, leaving the Stork clan and the Stork name behind, and she married a Victor Pross. So that is the man, my grandfather, biologically speaking, but who, in terms of when I speak of him in fond memory, and for what this man has done for me, all the positive attributes that I've obtained due to his influence and raising of me, I pay tribute to him by adopting his name, Victor Pross. So I did change that. I am Victor Pross. I have nothing to do with the Stork. So that's just a little bit of a preamble. When we talk about one of the most colorful figures in the history of Vancouver entertainment, Les Stork. Yeah, he came to town from Toronto, which is where I was born and raised, where he had worked in small clubs, ready to apply his experience to the West Coast scene. And in the fall of 1963, at the age of 30, Stork opened the Bunkhouse at the corner of Seymour and Davie Street here in Vancouver City, in a space with a basement that had been a print shop in the 1950s. After sinking what little money he had into the business, he had only 48 cents in the cash register for a float on opening night. But the Bunkhouse became a fast success, and that's an understatement. Like the Bunkhouse was the place to go in the 1960s. Man, it had everything. It had like gorgeous girls. It had a nice setting. It had ambience. It was cool. It was slick. It had jazz and folk musicians, very talented, who went on to become famous names in their own right. So the quality music, the music was there. So the Bunkhouse, as founded by my father, was the place to go. That was the hot spot in the 1960s. This intimate acoustic folk music venue became popular with the local touring musicians like Jose Feliciano and Josh White, Chad and Mitchell Trio, etc. Probably names that are lost or forgotten by now. The most popular name here would be Jose Feliciano. Now, you know who that is. He's the guy who did a Spanish version of The Doors' Light My Fire, and he's also popular for that Christmas tune, I Want to Wish You a Merry Christmas. I'm sure that you hear every year. That's Jose Feliciano. He got his start in my father's club at the Bunkhouse. I had the pleasure of meeting him when I was a teenager. He attempted to give me a few, we talked about music, and so forth, or what we like, and he attempted to give me some guitar lessons. Completely hopeless. I have no talent in that area whatsoever. But nice guy. Nice guy. And in 1964, Stork made headlines when he broke up a robbery at the Bunkhouse. Now, here is something that's very interesting. My father, for all his polish and very stylish guy, very charismatic, very entertaining, had the gift of gab, very funny, a ladies' man. The man wore alligator shoes, for Christ's sakes. He marched to the drum. He marched to the beat of his own drummer. But he was a tough son of a bitch, man, a tough son of a bitch. And he also had an artistic temperament as well. He was inclined and did dabble in painting and drawing. And that's where I guess I can say that I got my talent from him. I guess I got that, carried that artistic gene, such as it was. But he was also a tough guy, so it was kind of complex in that way. Very stylish. Didn't necessarily come across as like some kind of like a tough guy. He's always very charming and entertaining and engaging and so forth, but he was tough. Now, one night in the early fledgling days of the bunkhouse, when I was just getting started, my father was counting that night's proceeds. He was the host of the club. He was the cashier. He was the manager. He was the accountant, whatever. And he was counting that night's proceeds. And two guys came into the club. And my father explained that the club was now closed. And they walked right into the office, to my father's surprise. And one guy pulled out a knife. Now, there was two guys. My father was alone, counting that night's proceeds. It was probably a very good evening, considerable amount of cash sitting there on the table. These two guys come in, one guy pulls a knife. Now, if you know anything about my father, let me just say this, that that was the guy's first mistake. That was the guy's first mistake. They quickly found out that this guy was no wallflower. I mean, he just took them both out. Upper jab, broke the guy's nose, disarmed him, busted the knife from his hand, kicked the other guy in the face, a couple of chops. My father was a boxer in the 1950s. Tough, wiry kind of guy, but muscular. 6 foot even, I think, was his height. And just a very tough disposition, too, when you crossed him. Like he could be charming and funny, but he also had that dark underbelly side as well. So that was the first mistake that those guys made. And I was always astounded by this story. And here it is, immortalized. So I've always just heard it in the family circles, this famous story of my father taking out two guys trying to rob him. And here it is, 2019, released in this book. It's still blowing my mind because I bought the book today. Now, in 1966, listen to this. Stork had another run-in with the law enforcement. One night, police and city licensing officials came to the bunkhouse and charged Stork with obscenity because of a new feature at the venue, and the first for the city: topless waitresses. Yes, my father was the fountainhead and innovator of the phenomena known as topless waitresses. Kind of a step up, I guess, from Hooters. A little bit more exposure is involved in this case, and this was in the 1960s, for Christ's sakes. Jesus. So during the mid-1960s, city officials in Vancouver were just beginning to come to terms with the concept of topless entertainment in cabarets, but restaurants did not fall under the same licensing categories and rules. Because cafes weren't initially covered by the bylaws, Stork and the bunkhouse were at first free from scrutiny. As a folk music club with topless waitresses, the bunkhouse definitely had a unique atmosphere compared to other places. News that had originally managed to avoid a license, inspectors gained considerable attention. Newspapers from as far away as Pennsylvania, were writing about the intimate little coffee house on Davie Street. So this whole licensing issue, became like news crossing borders right into Pennsylvania, for Christ's sakes. What's going on with the licensing of that bunkhouse in Vancouver? It's like really whacked, for Christ's sakes. Stork cleverly used the headlines to promote his club. Now that's where they promoted, and the entrepreneur kicks in, right? When it comes to this, instead of having it serve as negative publicity, he's blowhorning it. And my father was also made a lot of articles written by Jack Wasserman, who was a popular columnist at that time. Jack Wasserman was the popular columnist to read in 1960s when it came to the entertainment scene, and he covered a lot of articles on my father. Stork protested the city licensing, but was forced to comply with the regulators and have the waitresses wear see-through tops. So the authorities did come down on my father when it came to the whole thing of topless waitresses. Excuse me, city bylaw officials. Excuse, I beg your pardon. City bylaw officials probably didn't appreciate his flippant attitude to the whole affair. Now listen to this. He may not have been popular with city license inspectors, but Stork was well liked among his peers. He was a colorful guy and fun, recalls drummer and club owner Gary Taylor. But beneath the fun, though, lurked an increasingly dark lifestyle that led anyone who got near Stork to disaster. Boy, this book might really be underplaying it. What a nasty bastard my father was. Yeah, but it's such a revealing sentence, though. It's just like really revealing. Beneath the fun, though, lurked an increasingly dark lifestyle that ultimately led anyone who got near Stork to disaster. I mean, that's a pretty strong word, for Christ's sakes. Might want to fill that out with a few concretes, but the writer just gives these quick little bullet point snippets from a man's whole life. And then the article goes on to quote my brother. My father is a rags to riches and back to rags story, says Kevin Stork. Born in 1961, Kevin Stork is not without some fond memories of his father. He can recall his parents taking him to visit the bunkhouse on a few evenings when he was 5 years old, sitting on Jose Feliciano's lap and meeting some of the stars who played there. And at some point in the mid-60s, though, Les Stork developed a serious cocaine addiction, which quickly began to affect not only his personal life, but also his business. And my brother goes on to say, I think my father was attracted by the aura of the nightclub business. He was successful in the beginning. He had it all to make it big. And he had a real knack for being a showman. And he could have promoted anything, but he went another way. His ego and cocaine was used to lead to everything coming crashing down. Yeah, so that's the thing, is that my father got involved with some pretty dark characters and was a pretty dark guy himself. But here's the thing, though, when we speak of my path to anarchism with a father like this, you know, I had seen this violent, darker side. I've crossed with it, even though I was safeguarded by being raised by my grandparents. It doesn't mean that I didn't come across my father. I do have fragmented memories of him in the 1960s. And the effect that has left this impression on me, at least in my subconscious, was a rather cold figure. But I do distinctly remember my father in later on, getting out of the 60s, around 1970, in the early 1970s, or 1974, when I was 12 years old. I came from Toronto to Vancouver with my grandmother. My grandfather, Victor Pross, had already died. And now it was all a matter of what's before me as a male figure would be my actual biological father. Now that my beloved sentimental father, my grandfather, Victor Pross, had long passed and was resting in peace. And when I came out to Vancouver to meet my father after a long break, what do I find before me? That I'm visiting my father in jail. So how do you like that? I'm there. There I am, a 12-year-old boy, and visiting my father in jail with all these cops and keys and metal doors and some screams and shouts off in the distance, echoed through long corridors, green and inhospitable and cold, everything metallic and harsh. And that's quite an environment for, a kid, right? Visiting his father. And here I am. I'm a guy that was raised and weaned on all types of TV simcons where there was a definite sappy influx of all types of family-oriented shows, you know, where the fathers were always portrayed as conscientious and stern, but loving and fair and just and good, ultimately good. All these characters, you know, starting from the 1950s, Fathers Knows Best, carrying off into the late 50s, early 60s, Leave It to Beaver, Ward Cleaver, later on with The Courtship of Eddie's Father, Mike Brady of the Brady Bunch. Then you have other family shows like The Waltons, Eight is Enough, and a show that's called, lo and behold, Family. So I was influxed and I was weaned on all of these shows, and a definite impression of what the father figure is supposed to represent definitely left its impact on me. And I figured, yes, that is a beautiful abstraction. I want that abstraction. I was chasing a phantom abstraction. And even later on, when I was 14 years old, I again went back to Vancouver to live with my father. My grandfather, as I said, had passed. My grandmother was still alive, but she had sent me off at the age of 14 to spend the summer with my father and his live-in girlfriend. Whereas I'd been previously, of course, living with my grandmother, still going to high school and whatnot. But I guess she wanted a little break and she sent me off. Now I have to wonder, all of this in hindsight, of course, is that with the history of this man, this violent man, this guy who's involved in the criminal underworld, where there's definite danger that can be there. There's definitely a case of where danger can be, that had transpired to very ugly situations in the drug world, and I've been exposed to it. You know, some of the ugly, shady characters that did come by were very intimidating, and drug deals were going right on under my nose living with my father, for Christ's sakes. And I have to ask myself the question, is that what the fuck was my grandmother thinking when she sent me off to this guy? Was she like so delusional that she gets so enamored with the abstraction? Well, that's my son. You know, this whole idea of family. Well, I'm going to bring the father and son together here. That's my mission. That's what I'm going to do in my final years, my golden years, is bring these two together since they've been separated. But that was just all nonsense, though. It was a disaster. But here's the thing, though, is that I was chasing that phantom. I was looking for a relationship from this guy, and it just never came. He was just completely closed off. He was cold. I remember sometime I'd say, hey, let's do this, let's do that, let's go see a movie. Remember sitting in a movie, peripheral vision, I can see my father, he's looking at his watch. He wanted to be anywhere except in that movie theater, sitting beside his son. So a complete cutoff there. But I chased that abstraction, though. I always tried to chase that abstraction. But here's an interesting thing, though, where what Stefan Molyneux used to call the true self came bubbling up to the surface. Some of my true feelings that I had been buried came to the surface one time when, in some conflict with my father, we got into a little argument over something, maybe something involving school or a house chore or whatever. That doesn't matter, but we got into a little fight. And, he took the father role, to talk about like grounding me or taking away the keys or not being able to go away for the weekend or whatever. And I just thought, what, like my father had passed long ago. Who are you? That was my feeling. And I said, I remember this like very distinctly, like it was yesterday. And I said, oh, really? Well, after all these years and now you want to play dad. And the next thing I know, as this big mitt of a hand comes smacking down right across my face. Not a punch, but open hand slap right across the face, leaving an imprint, leaving a sting, a ringing in the ears. And that's the first time that I had really seen or experienced firsthand violence by my father, which had always just been something that I've known by hearsay and history of other family members, where I pretty much got off lightly. I mean, that was nothing what was said to be have suffered at the hands of my brothers. Now, and I think back to other times too when it comes to the whole issue of violence. When I do think of my grandfather, Victor Pross, there was a time when I, as a child, hit another kid in the schoolyard who said something very despairing about my grandparents. There had been some kind of like a parent-teacher evening where the parents all come out to the school for some evening festivities. It could have been a Halloween celebration or something like that, like the night before Halloween. And I remember like all the parents coming, and I'm meeting all my friends and my classmates' parents, and they're all pretty much like a younger set, as you can imagine, just in their 30s, let's say, or even late 20s. And here's my grandparents, old and a little bit disheveled, gray topped. And so one kid was making fun of that, and I hit him, right? Just get to the bottom line, I hit him, and it was wrong. My grandfather reprimanded me for this. I was like 10 years old, and he reprimanded me. He was not very pleased with this, and he made it known that it was wrong and that I shouldn't have done that. I tried to explain, but you don't understand, Granddad, what this guy said. No, he's dissing you. I didn't use that word, of course, modern slang. He's dissing you and my mother, my grandmother, and dissing you, and he said, doesn't matter. What he brought it down to, listen to this. This is what he brought it down to. Who hit who first? Who initiated the violence? And I said, well, yeah, but you understand, like he said, no. Never mind who said what. Who threw the first punch? Who threw the first punch? And I did. I had to admit that, right? He just brought it down to that's all he cares about. That's all that matters, God damn it. You don't do that. So he made that point clear. Later on, of course, as a teenager, when I became interested in philosophy, when I came across anarchism as a system of thought by the writings of Murray Rothbard and reading, of course, the classic limited government advocate, minarchist Ayn Rand, all these thoughts of liberty and nonviolence and rights. Later on, to of course, to hear about peaceful parenting and so forth, and scar tissue and things like that. All of that, it just all gelled with me. It just thought, yes, like this is the path. I do not want to be my father. Do not want to be this guy. He has that gift of gab, has that appreciation of the arts. He dabbled in the arts himself. I'll take that from him, even if it wasn't meant to be given, but I'll take that from him. The rest, I cut this guy off as being completely dead to me. And it's Victor Pross, who ultimately can be, let's say, I guess, the foundation of my anarchism, of how I became an anarchist artist. Well, there you go. I'll just cut it off from there. Victor Pross signing out. Pop goes to culture.